June 24, 2023, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy renews his calls for the West to provide Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. It's a call that he's made several times before, practically since the beginning of the war. He believes the American-made fighter will massively enhance Ukraine's defenses. As he puts it, "And when we ask to give us the F-16 fighters or the ATACMS, we're enhancing our common defense. Real defense. This is what's needed. Now is the time to provide all the weapons necessary for defense." Back then, the Western nations that could deliver F-16s ignored the call, not because they didn't want to help Ukraine, but because they see the delivery of F-16s to the country as a potential escalation of the conflict that could draw them into the battle. Things change. Fast forward to mid-2024 and F-16s are on their way to Ukraine. What's more, Zelenskyy now has permission from several countries to use their weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory, marking the first time Ukraine has been able to do more than simply defend itself on its own land. This marks a huge shift in the war. F-16s will soon fly over Russia to bomb strategic positions that Vladimir Putin and his troops have been using to coordinate their attacks in Ukraine, and in doing so, they may create the risk of an escalation that could bring the full force of NATO into the conflict. That brings us to today's video and the key question: what does the F-16 bring to the Ukraine war? But before we dig into that question, it's worth examining how we got to the point where Ukraine is even in a position to use a plane that it hasn't had access to for much of the war. It all comes down to the United States. For the majority of the war, the US has supplied weapons to Ukraine with a simple caveat: Kyiv can only use them for defense. That meant no incursions into Russian territory and no strikes on strategic positions beyond Ukraine's borders. Ukraine respected those wishes, and the US had good reason to put those conditions in place. Speaking to PBS in May 2024, Emma Ashford of the Stimson Center noted that Ukraine had already been using non-US weapons to conduct long-range strikes on Russian targets, including oil refineries and factories. The problem, and her concern, came from the use of US weapons to conduct these attacks. I worry, and I think the White House is very worried, that allowing Ukraine to use US weapons to do that would be very escalatory. That created a problem for Ukraine. As Ashford's counterpart in the discussion, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, pointed out, that approach gave Russia free rein to attack from behind its border with Ukraine. If the Russians are firing at Ukrainians from a sanctuary, which is what they really have right now, then the Ukrainians ought to be able to shoot back. That's basic self-defense. That debate has been raging for almost 2 years, with the recent focal points being the Ukrainian Kharkiv region. As The Guardian reported in May 2024, Russia had started advancing north of Kharkiv with the intention of creating what Putin calls a sanitary zone along the border inside Ukraine. A 30,000-strong group of ground forces were gathered in the Belgorod region, with Russia backing those forces up with glide bombs. These bombs, which started life as general-purpose Soviet Fab bombs, are incredibly powerful and can be launched from behind the border to strike Ukraine. That's due to their gliding mechanism, which is essentially a pair of wings in place of a specific guidance system that allows Russian planes to drop them so they can glide over a large distance to a target region. Ukraine had little defense to these devastating bombs, not least because they were unable to attack the planes and installations behind the Russian border that were launching them. Ukraine needed permission to use the weapons it was receiving in Russian territory. And finally, the West's attitude to this problem is changing. On May 27, 2024, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly reported on the end of its spring session. During that session, the Assembly created a declaration urging Ukraine's Western allies to support Ukraine in its international right to defend itself by lifting some restrictions on the weapons provided by NATO allies to strike legitimate targets in Russia. Crucially, several major Ukraine allies supported the declaration. These included the Baltic state of Estonia, Poland, the Netherlands, France, and the United Kingdom. But perhaps the most surprising country on that list was the United States, arguably the nation that's most worried about escalating tensions with Moscow. Ukraine finally has permission to use American-made weapons in Russia, but again the permission comes with caveats. As The Guardian reported in May 2024, Biden's decision carries the condition that Ukraine can only use US weapons in the Kharkiv region and only for counterfire purposes. Ukraine also can't use American long-range missiles or ATACMS, which are tactical ballistic missiles, against Russia. But the decision opens the door for Ukraine to finally use an extremely valuable asset, the F-16. In truth, American approval for sending F-16s to Ukraine came long before it decided to allow their use behind the Russian border. A Reuters report from August 2023 noted that the US gave both Denmark and the Netherlands permission to send their American-made fighters, which triggered a coalition of 11 countries to form and start training Ukraine's pilots on how to use the jet. The donations of the jets are also starting to roll in. February 2024 saw Politico report that Denmark's first delivery of the 19 F-16s it's pledged should arrive at some point during the second quarter of 2024. The Netherlands won't be too far behind, not only with the 18 F-16s it originally promised to donate, but a further 6 it's able to send, after cancelling their sale to a private sector. Norway has also jumped onto the F-16 donation train by promising 22 of its F-16s to Ukraine, with Belgium adding another 30 to bring Ukraine's total to at least 95. The United States isn't sending any of its own stock to Ukraine, but the fact that it's provided permission both for other countries to send theirs and for Ukraine to use them across the border in Kharkiv is bad news for Russia. But why? Let's start with the F-16's specs. A multi-role fighter, the F-16 is capable of flying for around 500 miles when used in an air-to-surface role, with the US Air Force's website noting that it combines exceptional maneuverability with a high combat radius. That means it's capable of staying in the air for longer than many competing craft before returning safely back to base. The jet's engine delivers 27,000 pounds of thrust, and is capable of carrying 7,000 pounds of internal fuel, which can rise to 12,000 pounds with the addition of a pair of external tanks. At altitude, it can reach Mach 2, giving it a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour, and its flight ceiling is around 50,000 feet. But the highlight of the F-16, and one of the many reasons that Ukraine wants to have the jet in its arsenal, comes from its armaments. Each of the planes is equipped with an M61A1 20mm multi-barrel cannon, along with 500 rounds of ammunition. Essentially a powerful Gatling gun, this cannon can fire anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds per minute, with its multi-barrel design delivering 10 times the reliability of single-barrel guns. The cannon is capable of shredding through opposing aircraft in a matter of seconds, as long as the F-16's pilot can keep supplying it with rounds. Then there are the missiles. F-16s can carry up to two 2,000-pound bombs, which Ukraine will find useful for taking out Russian installations and positions behind the Kharkiv border. It also has a pair of AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. These short-range air-to-air missiles are made by Raytheon and are capable of moving at supersonic speeds. Each has an infrared homing guidance system, which enhances its guidance and tracking functions, and is a heat seeker. That means it's capable of identifying and tracking the heat signature the engine of a hostile aircraft produces, allowing it to home in and strike before that aircraft even knows it's coming. And there's more. Along with the AIM-9, the F-16 comes with 2 AIM-120 missiles. Another Raytheon product, this missile has home-on jamming and beyond visual range capabilities, meaning an F-16 pilot can fire and trust it to hit a target without getting visual confirmation. Crucially, that also means the pilot can fire without the enemy establishing visual contact, making the AIM-120 useful for stealth operations. The missile carries a 39.9-pound explosive blast fragmentation warhead and has a built-in active radar guidance system. That makes the AIM-120 less dependent on the F-16's fire control radar, enabling the previously mentioned beyond visual range capabilities, and serves to guide the missile to its target once it reaches self-homing distance. All told, it's a massive upgrade on the outdated Soviet-era Su-24, Su-25, Su-27, and MiG-29s that Ukraine also has in its air force. That brings us to another question. What benefits will the F-16s bring to Ukraine? Beyond the quality and weaponry, GIS says that the F-16 is likely to bring both new political and military dimensions to the Ukraine war. Offensively, the F-16 gives Ukraine better attacking options. These include the previously mentioned bombings of Russian positions, which the F-16 can carry out, while also being capable of fighting or evading any defending craft Russia may send out to counter it. However, the jet's multi-role capabilities mean it'll be useful in other arenas too. For instance, GIS notes that the F-16 could provide close air support to Ukraine's ground troops, with its M61A1 cannons being useful against armored vehicles, along with its mere presence being enough to divert Russian aerial combatants supporting their troops on the ground. The AIM missiles the F-16 carries also enhance Ukraine's strike capabilities. On the political side, GIS theorizes using F-16s to strike military and symbolic targets in Russia could create political pressure, especially in terms of impacting the morale of Russia's troops. But there are limits here. Ukraine still only has permission to attack over the border in Kharkiv, meaning it's unlikely we'll see its F-16s straying too far out of Ukrainian territory. Hitting Russian targets also creates the risk of escalation, meaning Ukraine will have to be smart in choosing which targets to strike. Those directly supporting Russia's push into Kharkiv, such as fuel depots and temporary bases, are the most likely targets. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, digs deeper into the tactical advantages having a fleet of F-16s delivers to Ukraine. It says that the receipt of enough F-16s allows Ukraine to create a fleet in being that will gain Russian respect in the aerial battle. However, that fleet likely needs to grow larger for the F-16 to have a real impact on the ground war. For now, having around 80 of the jets gives Ukraine more options for carrying out strikes, but it isn't enough to allow it to go head-to-head against the might of Russia's air force. After all, despite Russia having suffered heavy aerial losses during the war, it still has 809 fighter aircraft it can deploy compared to Ukraine's 72. Even with the addition of 80 F-16s, Ukraine's fighter fleet only grows to 152, around a fifth of the sheer numbers that Russia can bring to the table. There are also the integrative effects of delivering F-16s to Ukraine to consider. CSIS notes that most of Ukraine's military equipment prior to the war was Soviet era. Not only did that create challenges in terms of preparing an adequate defense against Russia's more modern equipment along with its larger forces, but it's also created sustainability issues. Damage, part shortages, and lack of appropriate ammunition all had the potential to hamper Ukraine, meaning it wouldn't have been able to withstand an attrition war for too long. Western support with modern Western weapons not only partially solved the equipment volume problem, but also enabled Ukraine to integrate its defenses with those of other countries. Don't underestimate the importance of this move. With Ukraine having Western weapons, it now also has access to the supply chains that keep those weapons working. With NATO and US-made weapons comes access to standard equipment that Ukraine can maintain and keep loaded with ammunition. The arrival of F-16s into Ukraine furthers that integration. The country's air force no longer has to try and keep Soviet-era fighter jets ticking over to present any sort of aerial threat to Russia. It has one of the most popular American jets ever made, with a built-in supply chain of countries that can not only provide the jets, but everything needed to keep them running. You can see this from the countries that have already donated F-16s. None are the United States itself. All are European allies that use the jet and are a part of the wider Western supply chain that's funneling equipment into Ukraine. In essence, the F-16's arrival means Ukraine is even less reliant on old and Russian-made technology. There's also the air superiority issue. CSIS agrees with GIS in stating that the arrival of the F-16s, at least in the current and fairly limited numbers, is unlikely to give Ukraine air superiority. What will likely happen is a continuation of the air parity already seen, especially as both Russia and Ukraine have adequate air defense capabilities. The key difference is that the F-16 gives Ukraine offensive options. As mentioned, Kyiv finally has an aircraft that's capable of conducting bombing raids while defending itself from or evading Russian defenses. That won't be enough for Ukraine to claim the skies, but it should give it the option of taking out targets across the Kharkiv border, such as sites from which Russia is launching its glide bombs. Ukraine will also be able to establish localized air superiority for limited periods. Through effective coordination with ground troops, this localized superiority could be enough to help Ukraine launch counterattacks against poorly guarded Russian positions inside Ukraine, perhaps allowing Kyiv to reclaim some of the territory it's lost during the war. It's also important to note that deploying F-16s doesn't come without challenges. Key among these is the level of training needed to successfully utilize the F-16. Again, remember that Ukraine's pilots are trained in Soviet-era jets. Not only are these jets dated, but they use different systems than the F-16. The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, highlights this by pointing out that the major upgrade the F-16 delivers over the Soviet jets Ukraine currently has comes with the caveat of extensive training being required to make a transition. It says that US training for foreign F-16 pilots is currently carried out at Arizona Air National Guard by the 162nd Wing. In all, that training typically takes 9 months and requires 90 hours of flight time on average. CFR says that several Ukrainian pilots are currently receiving that training as of March 2024, meaning they won't likely be ready to pilot the craft until the end of the year. In other words, Ukraine can't immediately deploy its F-16s and is going to have to spend several months fighting without them. The previously mentioned coalition of 11 countries formed to deliver training will help in some respects. For instance, CFR points out that Ukrainian pilots are also being trained at centers in Denmark and Romania, mitigating the need for pilots to travel to the US. Still, the training burden can't be overlooked. Even the most experienced Ukrainian pilots may feel like they're starting from scratch due to the array of complex systems built into F-16s that they won't have encountered in their Soviet jets. There's also the maintenance aspect to consider. An F-16 isn't a jet that you can simply keep hanging around until you need to use it. There are a lot of people who work on the ground to keep the jet in flying shape and ensure its weapon systems operate properly. CFR calls this the logistics tail of the jet, noting that a typical package of 12 F-16s requires a ground crew of 250 people to keep them viable. Given that Ukraine now has around 80 F-16s on their way, that means they're going to need at least 1,500 trained people to handle the ground crew duties. This crew includes typical maintenance staff such as mechanics, crew chiefs, munitions loaders, and airframe specialists. There's also the intelligence side of things. Each F-16 needs a team of intelligence analysts who feed data into its targeting systems and help to create the mission packages for the pilots. Without these ground crews, pilots are less effective operationally and are flying jets that may be incorrectly calibrated for the missions they undertake. Add to this the defensive requirements. Russia will surely target any F-16s it sees parked for extended periods, and the arrival of the F-16 isn't the cure-all for Ukraine's wartime woes. It's simply another tool in the country's ever-expanding arsenal, and one that, if used correctly, could allow it to conduct strikes within Russian territory. But there's a trade-off at play here. The F-16 facilitates higher-impact missions, such as the aforementioned bombing runs on Russian targets. However, they require more maintenance, even down to the state of runways. Given the jet's single-engine design, it's more prone to damage from littered runways than the Su-27 or MiG-29, another small challenge that Ukraine's F-16 support crews will have to handle. Finally, there's the biggest challenge of all, a challenge that affects both Ukraine and the NATO allies that are providing it with F-16 jets: Putin's threats. Speaking to Russian Air Force pilots in March 2024, around the time that the conversation about sending F-16s to Ukraine heated up, Putin seemed bullish in his response to the arrival of the jets. He told his pilots, if they supply F-16s, and they're talking about this and apparently training pilots, this will not change the situation on the battlefield. Putin went on to claim that Russia is equipped to deal with F-16s just as it can handle tanks, armored vehicles, and any other equipment Ukraine can throw at it. In other words, Putin claims that Russia can just shoot Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky. That remains to be seen. More chilling is the warning he tacked on to the end of his speech. Of course, if they will be used from airfields in third countries, they become for us legitimate targets, wherever they might be located. The message is clear. If Ukraine is to have F-16s, the countries supplying them better not serve as launching points for those jets. If they do, they become targets for Russia and may be subjected to the same attacks Ukraine experiences now. Again, how legitimate that threat may be remains to be seen. Plus, it's extremely unlikely that any third country will allow Ukraine to take off within its territory, with the F-16s provided all likely to stay in Ukraine. Still, there's a clear escalation of tensions between Russia and NATO attached to the provision of F-16s. And according to several sources at NATO, the West needs to prepare for the possibility of further Russian aggression following the Ukraine war. One of those people is German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. Speaking to the German parliament, and as reported in Politico in June 2024, Pistorius claimed that Germany and NATO need to be ready for war with Russia by 2029. His reasoning partially comes down to growing concerns that Russia may extend the aggression it's showing toward Ukraine to several other Eastern European countries. The Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are at risk, as are Finland, Sweden, and perhaps even Poland. All are NATO members, and all have been a target for Putin's rhetoric. Not least because several have cautioned NATO and the European Union that Putin is unlikely to stop if he takes Ukraine. Pistorius echoes these sentiments, telling Germany's parliament, "We must not believe that Putin will stop at Ukraine's borders when he gets that far." His comments build on those from the German Army's Chief Inspector, General Carsten Breuer, who believes it will take Russia between 5 and 8 years to rebuild its armed forces following the long grind of the Ukraine war. According to Politico, that gives Germany and NATO until 2029 to ensure it's prepared for further Russian aggression. So perhaps the arrival of F-16s in Ukraine isn't just about supporting Kyiv in its efforts to fight off the Russian forces. It may also represent a change of attitude towards Russia. Europe in particular appears to be collectively waking up to the possibility that Russia's campaign may not end with Ukraine. Worse yet, every action European countries take to support Ukraine, from providing military aid to sending F-16s to Kyiv, heightens tensions further. Perhaps they'll find themselves in a catch-22, support Ukraine and risk angering Putin, or sit back and watch, potentially opening themselves up to become Moscow's next target. In that situation, it appears that many European countries are choosing to risk angering Putin. Several have already pledged or are in the process of sending F-16s to Ukraine, and it's possible that more will follow. While these jets won't grant Ukraine full air superiority, they, combined with the recent US approval for using them in selected Russian territories, give Kyiv more options for combating Russia's advances. Perhaps the arrival of F-16s in Ukraine could be a trigger for Ukraine mounting a pushback against the slowly advancing Russian forces. Alternatively, they might be the catalyst for a wider war erupting between Russia and much of Western Europe. Again, it all remains to be seen. This leaves us with one more thing to do. Ask you what you think the arrival of F-16s in Ukraine could mean for the war and the future of Europe. Do you think Ukraine can effectively use these jets to fight back against Russia, or are they too limited in number to make a real impact now that Russia has advanced so deeply into Ukrainian territory? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Putin dreads the F-16, or click this other video instead.